The world before America in the early 1500s, the world was shifting. Spain dominated the New World. Portugal controlled global trade routes. France had begun exploring North America. And England, still recovering from political turmoil, stood on the sidelines. But beyond the Atlantic was a vast land, rich with forests, rivers, and resources. A land inhabited by millions of indigenous people who had built complex civilizations for thousands of years. This is the story of why England turned its eyes toward America and how that decision transformed world history. European competition for thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot in the Western Hemisphere. The lands that would one day be called America were home to vast, diverse, and advanced indigenous civilizations. These societies had their own political structures, economies, trade systems, technologies, and deeply rooted cultural traditions. But in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a dramatic shift began, one that would reshape the entire Atlantic world. This shift was triggered not by accident, but by intense rivalry among European powers. And it is within this competitive landscape that England's eventual colonization of North America took form. To understand why England colonized America, we must begin with the nation that first dominated the new Atlantic frontier, Spain. After Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492, Spain moved quickly to claim large portions of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. When Spanish conquistadors discovered massive stores of gold and silver in regions such as Mexico and Peru, Spain became the wealthiest empire in Europe almost overnight. Treasure fleets transported unimaginable amounts of precious metals across the Atlantic each year, strengthening Spain's military, expanding its global influence, and financing its political ambitions. This sudden explosion of wealth created a shockwave throughout Europe. Nations that once considered themselves equal competitors watched as Spain rose into a superpower. And England, a smaller kingdom still recovering from internal conflicts, saw the danger clearly. If Spain continued to dominate the oceans and accumulate wealth, England feared it would be pushed aside economically, politically, and militarily. The balance of power in Europe was changing, and England understood that survival required strategic action. At this time, Europe was locked in a series of ongoing struggles, religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, intense naval rivalries, and competition for control of trade routes. Every major nation sought access to Asia, Africa, and the newly revealed lands across the Atlantic. In this environment, acquiring colonies was not simply an opportunity, it was a necessity. Colonies meant land, resources, trade, wealth, and perhaps most important, prestige. Without overseas territory, a nation would fall behind. For England, the success of Spain forced a difficult realization. Staying within its island borders would not be enough. The country needed its own sources of wealth, its own overseas markets, and its own foothold in the New World. But England's motivations extended beyond economics. There was also national pride. Watching Spanish triumphs stirred frustration and resentment. English leaders believed their nation deserved a place among the world's great empires. Many in England saw colonization as a way to challenge Spanish dominance directly. The competition was not only economic and political, it was also deeply religious. Spain and Portugal were Catholic superpowers aligned with the Pope. England, after breaking from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, represented the Protestant cause. Rivalry between Catholics and Protestants was fierce, often erupting into violence and war. Colonization became another theater in this global religious struggle. Establishing English colonies in America was seen as a way to expand Protestant influence, weaken Catholic Spain, and spread English values across the Atlantic. By the mid-1500s, England began exploring new strategies to insert itself into the Atlantic world. English privateers, essentially government-supported pirates, raided Spanish treasure ships, capturing gold and silver that once belonged to the Spanish crown. Figures like Sir Francis Drake became national heroes for disrupting Spain's wealth pipeline. These raids showed England something important. Wealth flowing from the Americas was not only real, it was accessible. But England knew that piracy alone was not a long-term strategy. The real path to power was colonization. To compete with Spain, England needed permanent settlements, reliable trade, and territorial claims recognized under international law. Early attempts at colonization, such as the famous Roanoke settlement, failed, but they marked the beginning of a new era. Even failure did not lessen the sense of urgency. European rivals were expanding rapidly, and England could not afford to fall further behind. Beyond Spain, other European nations also entered the race. France established colonies in parts of Canada, focusing on fur trading and alliances with indigenous nations. The Netherlands created trading networks that stretched across the Atlantic and into Asia. European powers competed fiercely for land, resources, and influence. This growing competition only intensified England's desire to secure its own share of the New World. Meanwhile, back in England, economic and social pressures continued to grow. Population increased, jobs were limited, and poverty was widespread. The economy was changing rapidly, shifting from feudal agriculture to early forms of capitalism. Many English leaders believed colonies could relieve domestic tensions by providing land for settlement, new markets for English goods, and opportunities for the poor. Colonies offered the promise of wealth, not only for the nation, but for individuals who hoped to rise beyond their circumstances. As the 1600s approached, England made a decisive turn. The government, merchants, investors, explorers, and religious groups all began looking across the Atlantic with renewed determination. Joint stock companies emerged, business organizations that allowed investors to pool money and share risks. These companies, such as the Virginia Company, became engines of colonization. They funded voyages, recruited settlers, and established early English settlements in North America. But make no mistake, every step was motivated by competition. England did not colonize America out of curiosity or goodwill. It did so to secure its place in the global hierarchy. Colonization promised profit, power, prestige, and protection from rival empires. The New World was not empty. It was filled with indigenous nations who would soon face the transformative and often devastating impact of European arrival. But to England, the land represented opportunity at a scale the nation had never seen. Spain's example fueled English ambition. Spanish wealth proved that the Americas were not just distant lands. They were strategic assets capable of shaping the future of entire nations. And England's leaders believed that only by establishing their own colonies could they protect the kingdom's interests and challenge Spanish dominance. Colonization became a national mission driven by survival, rivalry, and the pursuit of greatness. Throughout the late 1500s and early 1600s, English explorers sailed westward with increasing frequency. They surveyed coastlines, made contact with indigenous societies, and assessed resources. Each voyage strengthened the argument that English colonies could thrive. Reports spoke of fertile soil, abundant forests, rich fisheries, and potential for profitable trade. These glowing descriptions energized investors and policymakers who saw the chance to compete directly with Spain. But England's ambitions were not welcomed by Spain. The two nations clashed repeatedly on land and sea. Diplomatic tensions escalated into open warfare, culminating in the famous conflict of 1588, when the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England. Although the English victory over the Armada was decisive, the rivalry did not end. It only intensified the race for colonial expansion. Both nations now understood that control of the Atlantic would determine the future of Europe. By the early 1600s, England's competitive strategy began producing concrete results. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became the first permanent English colony in North America. It was a risky venture, plagued by disease, starvation, and conflict, but it survived. Its survival was a turning point. It proved that England could indeed establish lasting footholds in the New World. From that moment forward, English colonization accelerated, expanding along the Atlantic coastline. Every new settlement, whether founded for economic profit, religious freedom, or strategic advantage, was part of a larger pattern: the fight for dominance in an increasingly interconnected world. The English crown encouraged expansion, investors financed expeditions, and settlers crossed the ocean seeking new lives. The colonization of America became a national project shaped by global competition. In this environment, England's motivations were clear. Colonies provided raw materials that Europe demanded: tappo, timber, furs, and later, crops like rice and indigo. Colonies allowed England to control trade, strengthen its navy, and increase its influence. Colonies also served as a counterbalance to Spanish power, creating a strategic buffer that protected English interests in the Atlantic. In every way, competition drove England's actions. Meanwhile, indigenous nations experienced profound disruptions as English settlements expanded. Trade networks shifted, alliances formed and broke, and conflicts grew more frequent. European competition did not simply reshape Europe, it reshaped the entire Atlantic world, altering the lives of millions. By the mid-1600s, England had firmly established itself as a major colonial power. New settlements appeared from New England to the Carolinas. Each colony contributed to England's growing global presence, and as England's ambitions expanded, so did its conflicts with rival nations. European competition did not end with the founding of the first colonies. It continued for centuries, influencing wars, shaping borders, and driving economic transformations. But at its core, the English colonization of America began with one simple motivation: to compete. To prevent Spain from ruling the Atlantic, to secure wealth, land, and power, and to claim a place among the world's great empires. In summary, England colonized America not through chance or curiosity, but through strategic necessity. Spain's immense wealth threatened Europe's balance of power. Rival nations fought for influence. Religious tensions inflamed European rivalries. And England, seeking to protect itself and elevate its position, looked across the Atlantic and saw opportunity. Colonization became the solution. This chapter marks the beginning of a story that unfolds across centuries, a story of ambition, conflict, cooperation, survival, and transformation. A story shaped by competition among empires and carried out by countless individuals whose lives intersected across the Atlantic. England's colonial project in America would grow far beyond its original motivations, eventually contributing to the rise of a new nation. But it all began here with rivalry, ambition, and the struggle for power in a rapidly changing world. Religion, rivalries, and the rise of England for generations. Europe was a continent in constant transformation. Nations rose and fell, alliances shifted, and new ideologies challenged old traditions. But few forces changed Europe as profoundly as the movement known as the Protestant Reformation. Beginning in the early 1500s, the Reformation divided Christianity, fractured political relationships, and reshaped the global balance of power. This religious upheaval did not remain inside church walls. It spilled into every corner of European life: politics, warfare, exploration, and eventually colonization. England's rise in the New World cannot be understood without first understanding these religious rivalries. The Reformation began as a call for reform within the Catholic Church, but quickly expanded into a continent-wide movement. Protestantism spread through Germany, Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and eventually England. As Protestant groups grew, so did tension. Catholic nations such as Spain and France viewed Protestantism as a direct threat to their authority, and they fought fiercely to preserve Catholic power. Europe soon became the site of wars, persecution, and political realignments, all driven by competing visions of religion and governance. England found itself at the center of this conflict when King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church in the 1530s, establishing the Church of England. Although this break was initially political, it opened the door for broader Protestant reforms. Over the next century, England swung back and forth between Catholic and Protestant leadership, creating deep division inside the kingdom. Each new monarch enforced their own religious vision, Almoracis royals. Catholics were pressured or punished. Under Catholic rulers, Protestants faced imprisonment or death. Ordinary citizens lived in constant uncertainty, and many religious minorities searched desperately for a place to practice their beliefs freely. By the time Queen Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, England was firmly Protestant, but fragile. Other European nations viewed England with suspicion or hostility, particularly Catholic Spain and Catholic France. These religious divisions transformed into geopolitical rivalry. Spain saw itself as the defender of the Catholic faith, and England's Protestant identity made it a target. At the same time, Elizabeth recognized that England could not afford isolation. She needed to strengthen her nation, expand its influence, and challenge Catholic dominance in the Atlantic world. Religion, therefore, became tightly linked to national identity and foreign policy. For many English leaders, colonization offered a solution to multiple challenges at once. It allowed England to expand Protestant influence, compete with Catholic empires, and provide new opportunities for religious minorities seeking refuge. In England's view, spreading Protestantism across the Atlantic was not only a religious mission, it was a strategy of survival. Queen Elizabeth I played a decisive role in turning England toward the New World. Under her leadership, the Crown encouraged explorers and private entrepreneurs to challenge Spanish power overseas. Figures like Sir Francis Drake were celebrated not only for their daring naval achievements, but for striking blows against Catholic Spain. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, his raids on Spanish treasure fleets, and his victories at sea turned him into a national hero. These actions had a symbolic meaning. Protestant England was no longer willing to remain passive in the face of Spanish dominance. Another key figure was Sir Walter Raleigh, who envisioned England's first colonies in North America. Raleigh believed that establishing Protestant settlements along the Atlantic coast would weaken Spain, secure new trade opportunities, and expand English influence. Although his early attempts, such as the Roanoke colony, ultimately failed. They represented the beginning of a long-term strategy, using colonization as a tool in the ongoing religious and geopolitical rivalry with Spain. At the same time, religious tension inside England continued to grow. Groups such as Puritans, separatists, and other dissenting Protestants believed the Church of England had not reformed enough. They sought simpler worship, stricter discipline, and a deeper form of religious purity. But their views often clashed with the government's vision, leading to persecution, restrictions, and social conflict. Many of these groups began to wonder if their future truly lay within England at all. America became a powerful symbol. It represented a blank canvas, a place where persecuted groups could build communities shaped by their own beliefs. It was far enough from the reach of monarchs, bishops, and religious courts. The Atlantic offered distance, opportunity, and hope. Although these groups did not yet fully understand the challenges they would face in the New World, the idea of America as a refuge grew stronger with each passing decade. Meanwhile, rivalry with Spain escalated. Spain's vast empire in the Americas generated enormous wealth, allowing it to finance powerful armies and influence European politics. England recognized that if it did not expand as well, it risked becoming a minor power overshadowed by Catholic nations. Colonization thus served multiple purposes. It was a religious mission, a political necessity, and an economic strategy. English leaders believed that their nation's future depended on establishing a presence in the New World. These motivations converged during the defining moment of 1588, when Spain launched the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet intended to invade and conquer England. The conflict was not merely a military clash, it was a symbolic confrontation between Catholic power and Protestant resistance. England's victory over the Armada shocked Europe. The defeat of Spain demonstrated that England was no longer a small, vulnerable island nation. It was now a rising force capable of shaping global events. This victory energized English ambitions for overseas expansion and opened the door for a new era of exploration and colonization. After the Armada's defeat, the idea that England could build a Protestant empire gained widespread support. Religious minorities saw it as a chance to escape persecution. Investors saw opportunities for trade and profit. The Crown saw a way to challenge Spain and protect the Protestant world. For many English citizens, the New World became a place of both necessity and imagination, destination shaped by conflict at home and competition abroad. By the early 1600s, England's commitment to colonization was clear. Joint stock companies formed to finance expeditions. Explorers mapped new coastlines, and settlers prepared for voyages across the Atlantic. Religious motives remained at the center of this movement. Many settlers believed they were carrying out a divine mission to build godly communities. Others saw themselves as part of a broader struggle between the Protestant and Catholic worlds. Colonization was not just economic, it was ideological. These overlapping motives culminated in the founding of early English settlements. Some, like Jamestown, were driven primarily by economic ambition. Others, such as Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, were formed by religious groups seeking freedom and autonomy. Each colony reflected a unique blend of religious ideals, economic goals, and geopolitical strategy. But all of them existed within the larger context of European rivalry. As English settlement expanded, so did the consequences. Indigenous nations encountered new forms of conflict, disease, and displacement. European powers fought for control of trade routes, alliances, and territory. Religion shaped diplomacy, warfare, and daily life in ways that affected millions. England's rise in the New World was inseparable from the religious battles that began in Europe. Throughout the 1600s, Protestant identity became part of English national pride. Colonies were often described as outposts of English culture and Protestant morality. Leaders encouraged the spread of English laws, customs, and values across the Atlantic. They believed these colonies would strengthen England's position, support its economy, and secure its future. In this way, religious ambition merged with national interest, creating a powerful force that drove colonization forward. Yet not all motivations were noble. Religious ideology sometimes justified violence, conquest, and displacement. English settlers often believed their faith granted them the right to claim land and govern others. These beliefs contributed to conflicts with indigenous nations and rival European powers. Religion, while offering hope to some, also fueled competition and destruction. This dual nature of religious motivation is essential to understanding the complexity of colonization. By the end of the 17th century, England had transformed from a divided certain kingdom into a major imperial power. Its colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, each shaped by different religious and political ideals. The global rivalry between Protestant England and Catholic Spain continued, but the center of this rivalry gradually shifted. The New World was no longer just a frontier, was a foundation for England's expanding empire. In summary, the English colonization of America was deeply shaped by religion, rivalries, and the desire for national strength. The Protestant Reformation fractured Europe and created new political alliances. England's break from the Catholic Church made it a target for Catholic empires, especially Spain. Conflicts at home pushed religious minorities to seek new beginnings overseas. And the broader contest for global power encouraged England to challenge Spanish dominance through colonization. Together, these forces propelled England into the New World and set the stage for the rise of a powerful Atlantic empire. Economic pressure at home. By the end of the 16th century, England was a nation under pressure. Its cities were swelling, its countryside was changing, and its economy struggled to keep up with the demands of a rapidly growing population. For many English people, daily life had become a struggle for survival. Poverty, unemployment, and hunger were no longer isolated problems. They were widespread realities shaping every corner of society. To understand why England pushed into America, we must understand the economic crisis unfolding at home. Population growth was one of the most significant forces behind this pressure. From the mid-1500s to the early 1600s, England's population nearly doubled. This rapid growth created demands that the nation was not prepared to meet. More people meant more mouths to feed, more workers competing for limited jobs, and more families seeking land that simply did not exist. English farmland had long been the foundation of the economy, but it was never designed to support such a dramatic increase. Rural families who had lived on the same land for generations suddenly found themselves pushed aside by forces beyond their control. One of those forces was the enclosure movement. Enclosure referred to the process of wealthy landowners fencing off common land spaces, once shared by villagers for grazing animals or growing crops. With these lands enclosed, small farmers lost the resources they depended on to survive. Many were forced to leave their villages and seek work elsewhere, contributing to a growing population of landless, impoverished laborers. These displaced men and women flooded into cities such as London, Bristol, and Norwich, hoping to find work in emerging industries. But these cities could not absorb everyone. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and living conditions were harsh. The combination of population growth and enclosure created what many English leaders saw as a dangerous situation. Crime increased, homelessness became common, and hunger spread among the poor. Government officials worried that social unrest could destabilize the kingdom. They believed that unless new opportunities were created, poverty would continue to rise and threaten the social order. America, though, still largely unknown, appeared to offer a possible solution. If England could establish colonies overseas, it could redirect its surplus population, create new jobs, and access new sources of wealth. At the same time, England faced competition from powerful European neighbors. Spain and Portugal dominated global trade, controlling profitable routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Their empires brought back gold, silver, spices, and luxury goods that enriched their economies and strengthened their militaries. England, by contrast, lagged behind. Its merchants struggled to compete, its industries remained limited, and its economy lacked the raw materials needed for growth. English leaders recognized that without access to overseas networks, their nation would fall further behind its rivals. One of England's most pressing economic needs was timber. Wood was essential for building homes, ships, tools, and infrastructure. As the population grew, England's forests were cut down faster than they could regenerate. Shipbuilding, in particular, required enormous quantities of oak, pine, and other strong woods. A nation hoping to compete on the seas could not afford a shortage of timber. North America, with its vast forests, offered a potential long-term solution. Colonies could supply wood, tar, pitch, and other materials critical for maintaining a powerful navy. Another growing industry in need of resources was the textile trade. England exported cloth throughout Europe, and wool production was one of the country's most profitable businesses. But wool prices fluctuated wildly, and competition from other nations threatened this foundation of English wealth. Merchants sought new markets and new materials to stabilize their industry. They believed that colonies could provide access to valuable fibers, dyes, and agricultural products that were scarce in England. Tobacco, for example, would eventually become a cornerstone of the colonial economy, generating enormous profits for English investors. As the economic challenges mounted, a new business model emerged that would reshape England's approach to colonization: the joint stock company. These companies allowed investors to pool their money to fund large, risky ventures, such as establishing settlements in the New World. No single individual could afford to build a colony alone, but a group of investors could share the cost and the potential reward. The Virginia Company, one of the earliest and most influential joint stock companies, was created specifically to establish an English presence in North America. Its investors hoped to discover gold, find trade routes, and create settlements that would generate long-term revenue. Promoters of colonization published pamphlets describing America as a land of abundance. They claimed that the soil was rich, the rivers full of fish, and the forests teeming with game. For the poor and unemployed, these descriptions sparked hope for a better life. Recruiters promised that even the poorest English laborer could become a landowner in America, something nearly impossible at home. Although these promises were often exaggerated, they tapped into a deep longing among the English people, the desire for opportunity, stability, and independence. Economic strain also affected England's social structure. Traditional systems of apprenticeship, which trained young men in skilled trades, could not keep up with the growing population. Thousands of youths found themselves without work, wandering the streets, or committing petty crimes. Parents feared for their children's future, and government officials sought solutions. Some believed that resettling young people in America could reduce crime and relieve pressure on local communities. Early proposals even suggested sending orphans and vagrants to the colonies as laborers, reflecting the desperation of the period. For the ruling class, colonization offered additional benefits. Landowners and nobles who invested in colonies hoped to expand their wealth and influence. Successful settlements could generate profits through agriculture, trade, and natural resources. At a time when European nations competed fiercely for global power, building overseas colonies was seen as a sign of national strength. England did not want to be left behind while Spain, Portugal, and France carved out vast empires across the world. Economic motivations were therefore deeply intertwined with national pride. England wanted to prove that it was capable of competing on the global stage. Establishing colonies meant acquiring new resources, opening new markets, and building a foundation for future growth. It was a strategic decision, driven not only by immediate hardship but by long-term ambition. Leaders believed that America could become a source of wealth that would benefit future generations and secure England's place among the great powers of Europe. However, the reality of life in the early colonies was far harsher than promoters suggested. The first settlers faced disease, starvation, harsh winters, and conflict with indigenous nations. Many early ventures failed, and survival was far from guaranteed. Yet despite these struggles, the economic motive remained strong. Colonies that survived eventually became profitable, and their success encouraged more settlers and more investment. As tobacco farming expanded in Virginia, as fishing and timber industries grew in New England, and as trade networks spread throughout the Atlantic, England began to see its economic gamble pay off. By the mid-17th century, the English colonies were transforming the Atlantic economy. Raw materials flowed from America to England, where they supported industries such as shipbuilding, textiles, ironworking, and manufacturing. In return, English goods, tools, cloth, weapons, and household items were shipped to the colonies. This interconnected system, known as the Atlantic economy, helped stabilize England's industries and provided new opportunities for merchants, sailors, and workers. The colonies were no longer experimental outposts. They were essential to England's economic future. In summary, the economic pressure at home played a critical role in pushing England toward colonization. A growing population, limited land, and widespread poverty created demand for new opportunities. Competition with European powers highlighted the need for overseas resources. Emerging industries required materials that England could not provide on its own. Joint stock companies offered a new way to fund ambitious ventures, and ordinary citizens sought a chance to escape hardship and build a better life. All of these forces converged to make America both a necessity and a promise, a place where England could relieve pressure, expand its economy, and secure its position in a rapidly changing world. The search for wealth. As England looked across the Atlantic, one motivation towered above all others: the search for wealth. The promise of riches had driven European exploration for more than a century, and by the time England turned its focus to America, the Spanish and Portuguese empires had already demonstrated just how much fortune could be extracted from distant lands. Spain discovered mountains of gold and silver in the Americas. Portuguese traders built vast networks across Africa and Asia. These achievements reshaped global power, and England, ambitious, competitive, and determined, knew it needed its own gateway to wealth if it hoped to survive and advance in a world dominated by imperial rivals. America became that gateway. When early English explorers set sail toward the unknown, they carried with them grand visions of precious metals and luxury goods waiting to be claimed. Reports from Spanish territories described unimaginable wealth: golden ornaments, silver mines producing endless treasure, and natural resources that enriched European courts. English leaders, merchants, and adventurers expected the same in North America. They believed that, somewhere across the ocean, rivers sparkled with precious stones, mountains hid their mineral riches, and indigenous communities possessed goods ripe for trade. These expectations were often unrealistic, shaped more by hope than evidence, but they fueled a powerful drive to explore, conquer, and claim. This hunger for wealth took form through the creation of joint stock companies. Investors pooled their money to send expeditions across the Atlantic, hoping that even if one voyage failed, another would succeed. The Virginia Company of London stands as the most famous example, founded with the clear purpose of extracting wealth from America. It financed the establishment of the Jamestown settlement in 1607. The company's charter explicitly stated its goals: find gold, locate profitable trade routes, and secure resources that could strengthen England's economy. The colonists were sent not merely to survive, but to search, discover, and return profits to their investors. Yet reality struck quickly. Jamestown settlers did not find gold. They did not find silver. They found hardships, swamps, disease, starvation, and conflict. Many early colonists focused more on searching for treasure than building shelters or planting crops, which led to disastrous consequences during the colony's first winters. English leaders had imagined America as a place where wealth would be easily gathered. Instead, the colony teetered on the edge of collapse. Still, the vision of riches did not fade. Investors simply shifted their expectations, searching for different forms of profit. One of the earliest profitable ventures in the English colonies was trade with indigenous nations. European goods such as metal tools, textiles, and weapons were exchanged for furs, food, and local knowledge. Furs, especially beaver pelts, became highly valued in Europe, where they were used to make fashionable hats and clothing. This trade brought modest profits, but it was not enough to sustain an entire colonial economy. Investors wanted something bigger, something more predictable, something they could control and scale. That opportunity emerged in a form no one initially expected: tobacco. Tobacco was not new to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had cultivated and used it for centuries. But when English colonists began growing and exporting it, they discovered that it appealed strongly to consumers in Europe. Demand for tobacco skyrocketed, and prices climbed rapidly. What began as a curious plant soon became the backbone of Virginia's economy. By the 1620s, tobacco was not only profitable, it was transformative. It provided steady income for planters, tax revenue for England, and reliable returns for investors. In many ways, tobacco became the American equivalent of Spanish silver, a commodity that reshaped the relationship between colony and empire. The rise of tobacco generated a need for land and labor. Tobacco exhausted soil quickly, requiring constant expansion into new territory. This expansion brought English settlers into increasing conflict with indigenous nations whose lands they encroached upon. At the same time, the harsh, labor-intensive nature of tobacco cultivation required a steady workforce. In the early decades, this labor came from indentured servants, Englishmen and women who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to America. Many hoped to gain freedom, land, and economic opportunity after completing their terms. For some, this dream became reality. For many others, illness, exploitation, and hardship defined their lives. Over time, as demand for labor grew, the colonies turned increasingly toward enslaved Africans. Although slavery existed in limited form in the early 1600s, it expanded into a fully developed system by the late 17th century. The search for wealth and the desire to maximize profits from tobacco and other crops played a central role in the growth of slavery in English America. This deeply tragic and brutal system would leave lasting scars on American history, shaping social and economic structures for centuries. While tobacco dominated the southern colonies, the search for wealth took different forms in other regions. In New England, colonists found profit in fishing, shipbuilding, timber, and trade. The vast forests of North America supplied the materials England needed to build and maintain its navy. Pine trees became especially valuable for their tall, straight trunks, ideal for ship masts. The availability of such resources strengthened England's maritime power, enabling it to compete more effectively with European rivals. New England merchants also engaged in Atlantic trade networks, exporting fish, timber, and livestock while importing manufactured goods from Europe and rum, sugar, and molasses from the Caribbean. In the middle colonies such as New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, the land was fertile and the climate mild, making it ideal for grain production. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye became the region's economic staples. These colonies emerged as the breadbasket of English America, supplying both domestic markets and international trade. Their strategic locations allowed them to grow into commercial hubs where goods flowed in and out, connecting rural farms with global markets. The search for wealth also drove exploration beyond the initial colonial settlements. Adventurers pushed deeper into the continent, mapping rivers, claiming land, and seeking new opportunities. English traders followed indigenous networks that stretched across vast distances, forming alliances and competing with French and Dutch rivals. Meanwhile, colonial governments encouraged settlement by offering land grants to settlers willing to move westward. Each expansion brought new resources: timber, fur, fertile fields, and eventually, minerals that tied America ever more tightly to England's economic ambitions. As the colonies grew more prosperous, England increasingly sought to regulate their trade through policies known as mercantilism. Mercantilism held that a nation's wealth and power depended on maintaining a favorable balance of trade, exporting more than it imported. To achieve this, England passed a series of navigation acts designed to control colonial commerce. These laws required that all colonial trade pass through English ships and ports, ensuring that profits flowed back to England. Raw materials such as tobacco, sugar, and timber could only be sold to the English market, giving England exclusive access to colonial wealth. While these policies strengthened the empire, they also sowed seeds of resentment among colonists who felt restricted and undervalued, foreshadowing conflicts that would arise generations later. Still, during the 17th and early 18th centuries, the relationship between England and its colonies was largely defined by economic mutual benefit. Colonies shipped raw materials such as tobacco, grain, timber, iron, and furs to England. English factories transformed these raw materials into manufactured goods: cloth, metal tools, weapons, household items, which were then sold back to the colonies. This cycle formed the backbone of the Atlantic economy, binding England and America in a web of commerce, opportunity, and dependency. It was not gold or silver that enriched England, but the steady, reliable flow of resources that sustained industries back home. By the early 18th century, the search for wealth had reshaped not only the colonies, but England itself. Colonial goods fueled the rise of English manufacturing. Trade profits financed the growth of cities such as London, Bristol, and Liverpool. Shipyards expanded, merchant fleets multiplied. Religious motivation by the dawn of the 17th century. England was not only a nation under economic pressure, was a nation divided by faith. Religious conflict had shaped English society for generations, and the tension between Catholics and Protestants had left wounds that ran deep through every class, every village, and nearly every household. These conflicts did more than change the nation's beliefs. They transformed politics, law, culture, and identity. And for many English families, they created a simple, desperate question: where could they live in peace? For thousands, the answer became America. To understand why faith drove settlement in the New World, we must look back to the English Reformation. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. This decision reshaped the nation's religious landscape overnight. It was not driven by theology. Along it was also political, personal, and economic. But once the break occurred, England was changed forever. Catholics became a persecuted minority. Protestants who wanted further reform later, called Puritans, felt the new church still resembled Catholicism. And everyone lived under a government that monitored religious conformity as closely as loyalty to the crown. For decades, England swung between extremes. Under Edward VI, the church became more Protestant. Under Mary I, it returned to Catholicism, and hundreds of Protestants were executed. Under Elizabeth I, the Church of England was re-established as Protestant, but she enforced uniformity strictly. Attendance at Anglican services was mandatory. Dissenters were fined, arrested, or driven underground. By the early 1600s, after years of turmoil, suspicion, and repression, England was a nation tired of religious uncertainty, but not free from it. This atmosphere produced many groups who felt spiritually trapped. Puritans believed the Church of England had not reformed enough. Separatists believed it was so corrupt that true Christians must leave it entirely. Catholics continued to face discrimination, barred from many professions and public offices. Even ordinary Anglicans often struggled with strict expectations and political oversight tied to faith. Across the country, people searched for a place where they could worship freely and live without fear of punishment for their beliefs. America offered that possibility. Unlike the European continent, where land was scarce and governments monitored religious expression closely, the New World appeared, at least in theory, to offer distance, space, and autonomy. English promoters of colonization advertised America not only as a land of economic opportunity, but as a sanctuary, where communities could build their spiritual ideals from the ground up. Some investors even believed that religious refugees made ideal colonists, disciplined, community-oriented, and motivated to work hard for shared goals. Religious migration began quietly, but soon became one of the most significant forces behind English settlement. The Separatists, who would later be called the Pilgrims, were among the first. Persecuted in England, they fled first to the Netherlands and then, longing for a place where they could develop their faith without cultural influence. They sailed to America in 1620. Their ship, the Mayflower, carried just over 100 people. Their arrival marked not only the founding of Plymouth Colony, but also the beginning of a broader religious movement that would shape America's identity. The Pilgrims' story is often romanticized, but their journey was perilous and their motivations complex. They sought freedom, yes, but also control. They wanted the ability to create a society governed by their interpretation of Scripture, without interference from kings, bishops, or foreign cultures. Their settlement was small, but its impact was enormous. It demonstrated that entire communities could move to America not merely to seek wealth, but to build a new kind of religious society. A larger wave followed, the Puritans. Unlike the Separatists, Puritans did not want to abandon the Church of England. They wanted to purify it, to remove rituals, hierarchy, and traditions they believed were remnants of Catholicism. But under King James I and later Charles I, Puritans faced increasing pressure to conform. Many were jailed, fined, or silenced. So, in the 1630s, thousands crossed the Atlantic as part of what historians call the Great Migration. Their destination was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Founded in 1630 by a group of Puritan leaders determined to build a city upon a hill, a model Christian community that would inspire reform back in England. This was not simply a place to survive. It was a place to create a spiritual example for the world. Their society was strict, disciplined, and intensely religious. Education was required so that everyone could read the Bible. Religious meetings shaped daily life. Leaders enforced moral and social codes. Church membership was expected. And while they sought freedom for themselves, they often denied it to others. enforcing their beliefs through law. America became a canvas on which groups painted their visions of the ideal religious society. The Puritans shaped New England's identity, but they were not alone. Other colonies soon emerged from religious motivations as well. In 1634, Maryland was founded as a refuge for English Catholics who had long faced discrimination at home, although Protestants would eventually dominate Maryland. The original charter reflected an important shift. America could serve as a safe haven for those marginalized by England's religious policies. In 1681, Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker whose beliefs had brought him into repeated conflict with English authorities. Quakers rejected violence, hierarchy, and compulsory worship. They refused to swear oaths or pay church taxes. In England, this made them targets. But in Pennsylvania, Penn created one of the world's most tolerant religious environments. Freedom of worship was guaranteed, and people of all faiths, including Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and others, settled there. Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams after his banishment from Massachusetts, became another sanctuary. Williams believed in something radical for the 17th century: separation of church and state. He argued that civil authorities should not enforce religious law. His colony became one of the first places in the Western world where individuals could worship or not worship without government interference. These colonies were not isolated examples. Across English America, religion shaped settlement patterns, government structures, and cultural identity. Some colonies were strict theocracies. Others were experiments in tolerance. Some sought purity and uniformity. Others embraced diversity. But all were products of the same historical force: the deep religious tensions of England. This did not mean religious life in America was peaceful. Far from it. Colonists carried their prejudices, fears, and rivalries with them. They disagreed over theology, governance, and lifestyle. They expelled dissenters, punished heresy, and created strict moral codes. Puritans clashed with Baptists. Anglicans clashed with Quakers. Catholics faced suspicion even in the colonies meant to protect them. But despite these conflicts, America still offered an environment far more flexible than England. Distance played a crucial role. The Atlantic Ocean separated colonists from English, bishops, courts, and political authorities. This gap created space for experimentation. Even strict colonies gradually softened some religious policies. Diversity grew as new waves of immigrants arrived. Germans, Dutch, Scotch-Irish, and others, all bringing their own beliefs and traditions. Over time, these communities interacted, blended, and produced new forms of religious expression. Another force shaping religious life in America was the question of identity. Colonists began to see themselves not only as English subjects, but as members of distinct communities defined by beliefs, experiences, and shared hardships. The pursuit of religious freedom, even in its imperfect form, planted seeds that would later grow into broader ideas of liberty, rights, and self-governance. By the early 18th century, religious motivations had become deeply intertwined with cultural and political development. The colonies were no longer merely refuges from persecutions. They were evolving societies with their own values. The Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies in the mid-1700s, challenged existing authority and emphasized personal faith over institutional control. This movement further strengthened the idea that individuals had the right to choose their spiritual path, a concept that would significantly influence American attitudes toward freedom and government. In summary, religion was not just one motive among many for England's colonization of America. It was a transformative force. Religious tension pushed individuals to leave England. Hope and faith drew them across the ocean. In America, they built communities shaped by their beliefs, some strict, some tolerant, all influential. Their pursuit of spiritual independence transformed colonial society, set the foundation for future ideas about freedom, and shaped the course of American history. Land and power by the early 17th century. England's eyes were fixed firmly on America only for wealth, and not only for religion, but for something even more fundamental: land. In Europe, land was the foundation of power. It defined status, determined political influence, and provided economic security. But England's land was limited, controlled by nobles, aristocrats, and a small elite. For ordinary English men and women, owning land was almost impossible. America changed that. Suddenly, the possibility of claiming, controlling, and transforming vast territories became a reality. Land was the key to England's expansion, and the colonies became the proving ground where that ambition would unfold. To understand this drive for territory, we must return to England's demographic and economic pressures. By the 1600s, England's population was rising. Agricultural land was scarce. Urban poverty grew rapidly. The enclosure movement transformed farmland into private estates, displacing peasants and small farmers. Many families found themselves without land, without work, and without hope. In this context, America appeared not simply as a distant place, was a lifeline, a place where land was plentiful and opportunity seemed limitless. English leaders believed that establishing colonies would relieve social pressure at home, expand the population abroad, and create new markets and resources for the empire. But England was not alone in this ambition. Spain, France, and the Netherlands were also establishing vast colonial empires. They claimed territories stretching across the Caribbean, South America, and North America. The race for land became a continental competition. If England failed to act, its rivals would dominate the New World entirely. Thus, colonization was not simply a dream. It became a strategic necessity. To secure power, England needed territory. And to secure territory, it needed colonists willing to cross the ocean and anchor English claims in America. The earliest English colonies were fragile footholds: Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay. But as settlements grew, so did England's territorial demands. Colonies expanded along rivers, coasts, and inland routes, each claiming land in the name of the English crown. These claims, however, clashed with the reality of indigenous nations who had lived in North America for thousands of years. For native peoples, land was not simply a commodity. It was a source of identity, tradition, sustenance, and spiritual meaning. The arrival of English settlers disrupted complex networks of alliances, territories, and diplomacy that had long existed between indigenous nations. This clash produced one of the most defining dynamics of early American history: the struggle for control over land. English colonists viewed land as something to be owned, fenced, bought, and sold. Indigenous societies saw land as shared, negotiated, and connected to lineage and responsibility. These different worldviews led to misunderstanding, tension, and ultimately conflict. Colonists repeatedly expanded their territory, pushing into native lands and demanding legal recognition of English ownership. Treaties were made, broken, remade, and broken again. Violence erupted in cycles that shaped the destiny of entire regions. One of the earliest and most significant conflicts was the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in Virginia. As the English expanded tobacco plantations, they encroached deeper into Powhatan territory. The Powhatan Confederacy, led by Wahunsanako, sought to maintain control over their lands while navigating the presence of a foreign settlement. The English, however, interpreted any resistance as a threat to their survival and their right to expand. Three major wars erupted between 1609 and 1646. Each conflict ended with further displacement of indigenous peoples and greater English control over the region. In New England, similar tensions emerged. As Puritan communities grew, they rapidly spread across the region, establishing new towns, farms, and fortifications. 90% of native populations in New England had been devastated by European diseases before large-scale settlement even began. This demographic collapse weakened indigenous nations, but it also created a power vacuum that colonists exploited. The Pequot War of 1637 was one of the most brutal conflicts of the era. English forces, along with native allies, destroyed the Pequot Nation, claiming its land and opening the region for further settlement. Later, King Philip's War in 1675 to 1676 shook New England to its core. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, led a coalition of indigenous nations against expanding colonial settlements. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in North American history relative to population size. Entire towns were burned. Thousands died. Although the English emerged victorious, the war left deep scars on both sides and resulted in the near-total destruction of indigenous power in southern New England. After the war, colonial expansion accelerated rapidly. These conflicts were not isolated events. Across English America, the struggle for land defined relations between colonists and indigenous peoples. The push westward continued decade after decade. Land grants were issued by the Crown, by colonial governments, and by private companies. Settlers cleared forests, built farms, and laid claim to territory that had been home to native peoples for countless generations. For England, each new farm, town, or trading post strengthened its imperial presence. For indigenous nations, it represented yet another loss of territory, resources, and sovereignty. Territorial expansion also shaped relations between England and its European rivals. The English contested control of the coastline with the Dutch, who had established New Netherland in the mid-1600s. New Amsterdam, located at one of the most strategic natural harbors in North America, became a commercial powerhouse. But in 1664, England seized the colony almost without a fight, renaming it New York. This act was not merely a military victory, it was a demonstration of England's increasing determination to dominate the Atlantic coast. Further north, England's competition with France intensified. The French had built a powerful network of trading posts and alliances along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley. Their control of these regions threatened England's access to the interior. Wars between the two empires erupted repeatedly in both Europe and America. Colonial territories changed hands, fortifications were built and destroyed, and alliances formed and collapsed. The fight for land was not only a local conflict, it was part of a global struggle for imperial supremacy. The need for land also shaped colonial society from within. Land ownership became the measure of success in America. It determined wealth, social status, political participation, and community influence. In many colonies, only landowners could vote or hold office. Colonists believed land represented independence, stability, and opportunity. This idea would eventually become one of the core values of American identity, the belief that ordinary individuals could own land and build their future. The hunger for land spurred waves of migration across the colonies. Settlers pushed inland from coastal towns into valleys, mountains, and river basins. Roads were carved through forests. Frontier settlements were built on contested ground. These expansions often violated treaties and triggered new conflicts with indigenous nations. Colonial governments struggled to control the frontier, but settlers moved with or without approval. This dynamic, colonists pushing westward, governments trying to regulate expansion, would repeat throughout American history. By the early 18th century, the pattern was clear. The English colonies were rapidly transforming into a territorial power. Population growth soared. Farms multiplied. Cities expanded. Trade routes stretched across the continent. The demand for land never slowed. It drove settlement, shaped policy, and defined relations with both native peoples and European empires. But land was more than an economic asset. It was a symbol of power. The more territory England controlled, the more influence it had on the global stage. Colonies provided resources, strategic ports, military advantages, and economic leverage. In the minds of English leaders, America was not simply a distant possession, it was an essential component of national strength. Yet this ambition carried profound consequences. As settlers spread westward, indigenous nations faced displacement, cultural disruption, and loss of sovereignty. Entire societies were reshaped by the arrival of English colonists. Forests were cleared. Hunting grounds disappeared. Sacred spaces were lost. Diplomatic traditions that had guided indigenous relations for centuries were replaced by treaties written in European legal language documents that often favored colonial interests. For the colonists, the pursuit of land created both opportunity and conflict. Frontier life was dangerous. Settlers faced harsh environments, isolation, and uncertainty. In many areas, they relied heavily on indigenous knowledge to survive. Cooperation and exchange did occur, particularly in the early decades of settlement. But as expansion accelerated, alliances weakened and hostilities grew. The frontier became a zone of constant negotiation and often violence. For England, the growth of the colonies brought wealth and strategic advantage, but also new challenges. Managing distant territories required resources and administrative complexity. Ensuring loyalty from settlers who were developing their own identities and interests was increasingly difficult. The more land colonists claimed, the more distant they became from English authority. By the mid-1700s, England and France were locked in a final struggle for control of North America. This conflict, known as the French and Indian War, reshaped the continent. It was the culmination of nearly a century of competition, expansion, and territorial ambition. When England emerged victorious in 1763, it gained vast new lands, but it also inherited new responsibilities and new tensions. In many ways, the fight for land helped set the stage for the American Revolution. English efforts to control Western expansion after the French and Indian War angered colonists who believed land was their right. Conflicts with indigenous nations continued. Competition among settlers intensified. The struggle for territory had shaped the colonies from the beginning. Now it would shape their break from the very empire that created them. In the end, land was not simply a reason for colonization. 'Twas the driving force behind English expansion. The source of conflict with indigenous nations, the heart of competition with European rivals, and the foundation on which colonial society was built. Land represented power, freedom, opportunity, and identity. The pursuit of land changed the landscape of North America, defined the early American experience, and created the conditions for the birth of a new nation. The economic machine of the American colonies by the dawn of the 18th century. The American colonies were no longer fragile outposts struggling to survive. They had become the backbone of a powerful economic engine, one that fueled England's rise on the global stage. But this system did not emerge overnight. It was built through decades of labor, trade, conflict, and ambition. This chapter investigates how the colonies transformed into a vast economic machine, reshaping both sides of the Atlantic. The economy of early America grew from necessity. Settlers needed food, tools, and shelter. Communities built around survival gradually evolved into centers of production. Forests became lumber. Soil became tobacco, cotton, rice, and wheat. Coastlines became ports connecting colonial goods to the markets of Europe and the Caribbean. And Native American trade networks, thousands of years old, became entangled in this expanding economic system, often with devastating consequences. One of the earliest and most profitable colonial industries was tobacco. In Virginia and Maryland, the plant quickly became a currency of its own. It paid taxes. It paid wages. It drove land expansion, created vast plantation systems, and transformed the Chesapeake region into one of the most important agricultural zones in the British Empire. But tobacco's success came with a human cost. It demanded enormous labor, which led to the expansion of indentured servitude and eventually the institutionalization of African slavery across the southern colonies. As the southern colonies built wealth through cash crops, New England constructed a different kind of economy. Lacking the long growing season of the South, New Englanders relied on the sea. Fishing, whaling, shipbuilding, and merchant trade became the lifeblood of the region. Harbors like Boston, Newport, and Salem connected the colonies to a global marketplace. New England ships traveled to the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and throughout North America. They transported goods, people, and ideas, making the region one of the most active maritime hubs in the world. Further down the coast, the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware Bay, came the breadbasket of British America. Their fertile soil produced wheat, rye, oats, and corn at levels unmatched by any other region. These colonies became known for diversity, diverse people, diverse crops, and diverse trade. German farmers brought advanced agricultural practices. Dutch merchants expanded commercial networks. Quaker communities emphasized fairness in trade and social organization. These cultural forces blended into a dynamic, prosperous region, fueled by farming, manufacturing, and international commerce. Together, these three regions, New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies, formed an interconnected system. Each produced something the others needed. Each relied on the Atlantic, and each depended on the broader framework of the British Empire, particularly the Navigation Act's laws that restricted colonial trade to benefit England. These acts required that colonial goods be shipped on British vessels, sold through British ports, and taxed according to British needs. While resented by many colonists, the system helped England strengthen its navy, expand its influence, and accumulate enormous wealth. Yet, the colonies also created shadow economies that operated outside Britain's rules. Smuggling became widespread. Merchants in New England traded rum, sugar, and molasses in complex cycles that tied the colonies to the Caribbean and Africa. Southern planters shipped tobacco illegally to increase profits. Frontier settlers traded directly with native nations despite colonial bans. These unofficial networks kept the economy moving, even when British restrictions tightened. Another crucial part of the colonial economy was land's availability, its fertility, and its endless expansion. Land meant opportunity for European settlers, but it meant displacement and conflict for Native American nations. As the economy grew, so did the push westward. Colonists sought farmland, hunting grounds, timber, and mineral resources. This expansion brought them into direct conflict with native peoples, undermining treaties and creating cycles of violence that deeply shaped the continent. By the mid-1700s, the colonies had become central to Britain's prosperity. American goods filled British markets. American ports fueled the Atlantic world. American resources powered British industry. And American consumers imported millions of pounds of British manufactured goods every year. The system was thriving, interconnected, and increasingly complex. But beneath the prosperity, new tensions were rising. Many colonists believed they deserved more freedom, more autonomy, and more representation in decisions that affected their economy. Britain, facing its own financial pressures after decades of warfare, saw the colonies not as partners, but as assets that needed to be controlled, taxed, and managed more strictly. This economic friction between Britain's desire for control and the colonies' desire for independence created the first sparks of a political crisis, a crisis that would soon erupt into protests, boycotts, and eventually revolution. In the next chapter, we will explore the escalating conflicts that emerged from this economic machine. Disputes over taxes, resentment against imperial authority, and the rising belief among colonists that they were no longer just settlers, but a distinct people with a growing sense of identity. An identity that would push them toward a defining moment in world history. The rising tension, taxes, rebellion, and the road to revolution. By the middle of the 18th century, the American colonies were thriving. Their ports were busy, their farms productive, and their trade networks stretched across oceans. To the world, the colonies appeared loyal, prosperous, and fully integrated into the British Empire. But beneath this surface was a growing instability, an economic and political pressure that Britain could no longer ignore, and the colonists could no longer tolerate. The spark for this change began far from American shores. In 1754, Europe's old rivals collided once again in what became the 7 Years' War, a global conflict between Britain, France, and their allies. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War, and it reshaped the continent. Britain emerged victorious, gaining vast territories from the French. But victory came at a price, an enormous war debt that London struggled to manage. To British leaders, the solution seemed obvious. The colonies, who had benefited from the war by gaining security and new frontiers, should help pay for the costs of their own defense. But two American colonists who had fought, died, and sacrificed alongside British soldiers, the idea of new taxes felt like an insult. They saw themselves as partners, not subjects to be billed for Britain's ambitions. In 1765, the first great test arrived. The Stamp Act, for the first time. Parliament imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies. Newspapers, legal documents, contracts, and even playing cards required an official stamped paper purchased from the British authorities. To London, it was a small, logical fee. To the colonies, it was a violation taxation without representation, a principle they believed no free people should accept. Across the colonies, resistance erupted. Merchants boycotted British goods. Newspapers denounced the law. And in Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized public demonstrations that shook the city. The pressure worked. Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But it added a warning. Parliament retained the right to tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. The debate was not about money yet, was about authority. In the years that followed, Britain passed more laws to assert control. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, colonists protested. Once again, boycotts spread. British officials responded by sending troops to major cities to maintain order. In Boston, the presence of these soldiers, poorly paid, far from home, and openly resented, created a volatile atmosphere. On March 5, 1770, tension exploded. A crowd confronted a group of British soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs became stones. Shouts became threats. And then, gunfire. 5 colonists were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. For many Americans, it was proof that Britain's government no longer saw them as citizens, but as rebels to be controlled by force. Despite the outrage, temporary calm returned. Britain repealed most of the Townshend taxes, keeping only the tax on tea. But even this small gesture carried a larger intention. Parliament would not surrender its right to rule the colonies. Then came the moment that pushed tensions past the point of return. The Tea Act of 1773. It granted the British East India Company a monopoly on colonial tea sales, undercutting local merchants, strengthening imperial control, and once again reminding the colonies of their political powerlessness. In response, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest, it was a declaration of defiance. London reacted swiftly and harshly. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston's port, dissolved local assemblies, and placed Massachusetts under direct military rule. British leaders believed these punishments would force the colonies into obedience. Instead, they united the colonies more than ever before. Delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, the first major step toward a unified American political identity. They declared the Coercive Acts unconstitutional, organized a colony-wide boycott of British goods, and called upon communities to prepare local militias in case British troop movements escalated. By this point, the conflict was no longer theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and unavoidable. Both sides were preparing for a confrontation neither wanted but neither could escape. Britain sought to enforce its laws. The colonists sought to defend their perceived rights. And as both sides mobilized, the air across the colonies felt electric, tense, and uncertain. Still, few imagined a full revolution. Most colonists did not want independence, only fairness. Even Britain hoped the colonies would fall back into line with enough pressure. But history was moving quickly, pulling them toward an outcome that would reshape the world. In our next chapter, we witness the moment when tensions ignited into full warfare. From Lexington to Concord, from political protest to open battle, the colonies stood on the brink of a transformation that would shape a new nation and redefine what freedom meant in the centuries to come.